Today you become a Polynesian wayfinder. At 7, my grandfather lashed me to a double-hull canoe mast to learn the stars. And at 52, I lashed my own grandson to that same mast to pass down everything I knew. In the year 1000, I was born in a small fishing village on the north shore of Tahiti, and my grandfather carried me down onto the sand so I could open my eyes for the first time on the stars above me. My father was the finest wayfinder our village had. Every voyage took him 30 days at sea, and he returned with the deck of his canoe heaped with red feathers and obsidian he had traded from distant islands. My mother sat all day beneath the coconut palms weaving pandanus leaf sails. She always said a good sail took 3 full months of weaving before any wayfinder would dare entrust his life to it. At 5, my grandfather lifted me onto the double-hull canoe beached on the sand. He pointed to the carved prow and told me this single piece of wood was the very life of all Polynesian people. At 6, I began learning the names of the stars with my grandfather, and he taught me that the Southern Cross and Capella and Sirius were the 3 most vital stars for any wayfinder who hoped to survive. At 7, my grandfather lashed me to the mast of a double-hull canoe and let the swells rock me all night, saying every wayfinder must first learn to read the temper of the sea through his own seat. At 8, I could point to and name 200 stars in the night sky without using my fingers, and for the first time my grandfather anointed my forehead with a single drop of cool coconut oil. At 9, my grandfather taught me to measure star altitude over the horizon using the width of my own outstretched palms, calling this the one true key to knowing which patch of sea your canoe was in. At 10, my grandfather wove me my first stick chart using thin bamboo branches and cowrie shells, telling me a wayfinder must always tell the long swell from the south apart from the short waves from the east. At 11, I learned to listen to the calls of the seabirds, and the black noddy turned flying home at sunset always pointed its wings in the direction of the nearest island to where my canoe drifted. At 12, I sailed the open ocean for the first time with my father, and he made me lie flat between the twin hulls of the double-hull canoe so I could feel every hidden swell through my own chest. At 13, I learned to read the feet of the clouds, and one solitary cloud anchored low against the far horizon meant a single island that no one had ever set foot on was hiding beneath it. At 14, I steered alone 200 nautical miles all the way to the Marquesas Islands. And the night I returned, the whole village danced sacred dances for me up and down the moonlit beach. At 15, my grandfather tattooed the first navigation line down my chest using a sharpened bone needle, a slender straight line representing the Southern Cross that ran all the way down to my ribs. At 16, I married the village girl who wove the finest sails of any woman among us, and she raised onto our wedding canoe mast the very first pandanus sail her own 2 hands had ever woven. At 18, I took over my father's canoe and began leading voyages of my own at sea, and on the very first trip, I brought 8 young paddlers down to the Cook Islands to trade for pearl shell. At 20, I began to plan a voyage northward into the Great Hawaiian Triangle, but the old men of the village said no wayfinder had returned alive from that route in over 200 years. At 21, I personally oversaw the building of a new long voyage double-hull canoe, and the twin hulls used the 2 tallest breadfruit trees that all of the island of Tahiti could offer. At 22, I pointed that new canoe straight into the Hawaiian Triangle to the north, loaded with 30 paddlers and enough dried coconut and sun-cured fish to last us 40 whole days at sea. On the 10th day at sea, we crossed the equator into the northern sky. The Southern Cross sank below the horizon behind us, and the North Star rose for the first time directly above my own head. On the 20th day at sea, the trade winds suddenly died on us. The surface lay flat as a slab of polished obsidian, and we drifted in that dead water for 4 full days under a merciless sun. On the 25th day at sea, I sighted a flock of frigate birds wheeling high in a tight column to the northwest, and I knew from the height of their flight that Hawaii lay hidden beneath them. On the dawn of the 30th day, we landed on the black volcanic sand of the big island of Hawaii, and all 30 of my paddlers fell to their knees to kiss the strange new sand beneath them. I lived on that Hawaiian island for 1 full year afterward, tattooing the Tahitian Wayfinder line onto the chests of every single young man on the island willing to study the stars under me. At 25, I came home to Tahiti at last, and my wife had borne me a daughter in my absence. She had held that child on the beach waiting patiently for me to return for 2 full years. At 27, I sailed north to Hawaii a second time and ran into a terrible storm at sea. The lightning split the main pandanus sail straight in half, and that voyage cost me 8 of my paddlers. The night I returned to Tahiti, I knelt on the sand and carved every one of those 8 paddler names one by one into a single piece of black volcanic rock raised at the head of our village. At 30, I began to doubt whether I still had it in me to truly red the sea. And before every voyage afterward, I sat the entire night before the volcanic memorial stone of my grandfather. At 32, I began to plan a voyage eastward to Rapa Nui, that lonely island in legend covered with standing stone figures, lying a full 1,000 nautical miles further out than Hawaii itself. On the 15th day at sea, we entered a dead sea where not even a single seabird could be sighted. And for 20 straight days no man aboard my canoe could swear which direction we were going. On the 40th day at sea, our fresh water ran completely out, so I had the men lay the pandanus sail flat on the deck overnight to catch the tiny droplets of dew condensing on its woven leaves. On the dawn of the 55th day, I sighted far to the east the black silhouettes of standing stone figures lining the horizon, and the whole crew dropped to their knees and could not utter a sound. We stayed on the island of Rapa Nui for 3 full months, and its people asked me to raise 3 new stone figures on their volcanic slopes using the wayfinding techniques of Tahiti itself. At 33, I came back from Rapa Nui all the way home to Tahiti at last, and from that day onward, every wayfinder across the 3 great islands of the South Pacific called me the Star King. At 36, I began teaching all the names of the stars and all of the wave charts by word of mouth to 12 carefully chosen young wayfinder apprentices selected from our own village. At 38, my single most gifted apprentice was caught in a squall on his way north to Hawaii and never returned, and the whole village kept a vigil fire burning 7 nights on the beach for him. At 40, I sailed for the 3rd time down to the Marquesas Islands to pass on what I knew, and that voyage took me a full month to cover the same route I had once sailed at the age of 14. At 42, I sat down on the Marquesan beach and taught every single one of the 200 star names I had carried my whole life, one by one, to all the children of those distant islands. At 45, my eyes began to fail at sighting the faintest star that hugs the very surface of the horizon, and right then I knew that my own life as a true wayfinder was finally drawing to an end. At 47, I made one final solo voyage down to the Cook Islands by myself, and after I returned home, I dragged my own wayfinder canoe high up the sand and vowed never to launch it again. At 48, my wife passed quietly away the very night she finished weaving the 100th pandanus sail of her life, and that final sail of hers I could not bring myself to sell to any soul. At 49, my daughter gave birth to a baby boy on the very same beach, and she knelt down and placed that newborn child into my arms, saying, "Please, grandfather, give him a name of your own." At 50, I carried my grandson down to the same stretch of beach my own grandfather had once carried me to, and I let him open his eyes for the first time on the Southern Cross above us. At 51, I laid out once more for my grandson the thin bamboo stick chart my own grandfather had once laid out for me, telling him a wayfinder must tell the long swell from the short waves. In the autumn of 51, I washed clean the old wayfinder canoe I had once dragged up onto the sand, and let my grandson sit on its weathered prow and run his small hands along its mast. In the spring of 52, I lashed my grandson to that same canoe mast and let the lagoon swells rock him through the whole night, exactly as my grandfather had done for me 45 years before. In the summer of 52, I pressed the carved conch shell trumpet handed down to me by my grandfather into the small hands of my grandson, telling him to sound it before every single voyage. In the autumn of 52, I sat one last night before the volcanic memorial stone of my grandfather, and just before dawn the Southern Cross sank gently into the western sea before my eyes. This was the life of a Polynesian wayfinder. If you have ever given yourself entirely over to a single stretch of sea, leave a comment. Next episode, pick A Viking raider, or B, a Byzantine eunuch. Vote in the comments. This is a fictional dramatization for entertainment only.